Hey everybody, this is Dustin with www.gamblingonfreedom.com. I'm a certified hypnotherapist specializing in problem gambling, gambling addiction, compulsive gambling, and in today's video I want to talk about why losing money doesn't stop a gambling addiction. One of the strangest things about gambling addiction is this. Losing money should make someone stop. If someone loses $1,000, $10,000, sometimes even their life savings, logic would suggest that the pain of losing should be enough to make them walk away forever. Most people assume that at some point the losses would simply outweigh their desire to continue. But anyone who has struggled with problem gambling knows that this often isn't what happens. In fact, for many people, the opposite happens. The more money they lose, the stronger the urge becomes to keep gambling, the more they chase their losses. So the real question we need to ask is, why doesn't losing money stop gambling addiction? Most people who have never really struggled with this problem believe that the problem is more about greed or poor discipline. And they assume that the gambler is chasing money and that if losing became more painful, then the person would just simply stop. And from the outside, this seems like common sense. Sure. But gambling addiction is rarely about the money in the way that people think it is. In reality, money is often just the vehicle that allows the real psychological reward to occur. And once you understand what the real reward is, it becomes much easier to understand why losing money often fails to stop the actual behavior. So, the real reward in gambling is not the money, the real reward is the change in emotional state that happens when you place a bet. So the moment someone places a bet, not just wins, but places a bet, something powerful inside the brain, the nervous system actually happen. Dopamine begins to rise, anticipation builds, adrenaline increases, and for just a brief moment, the person feels a surge of excitement, stimulation, or even just relief from whatever stress they were carrying before. And this is that sort of emotional shift that we're looking at, the real reward. For someone who has been feeling bored or anxious or overwhelmed or stuck, gambling can create a sudden intense change in how they feel, much like smoking or drinking or any other substance could. If you pay close attention to a gambler speaking, many gamblers will tell you that the most exciting moment is not actually winning the bet, it's the placing of the bet. It's the moment where everything becomes uncertain and full of possibility. The moment that creates more of this alive, stimulating feeling. It's sometimes even calming. Sometimes it's just that relief, like I was saying before. And so, in that state, worries about bills and work stress and personal problems just temporarily fade into the background. They, become a non issue. And so the brain just focuses on the game, the odds, the numbers, the outcome. And just for a moment, life feels a little different. And so the brain is constantly learning patterns about what changes our emotional state. We are pattern matching machines. When something creates a strong feeling of excitement or relief or stimulation, the brain begins to remember that behavior. Over time, it starts to build an association. Gambling equals powerful emotional shift, right? Once that association is established, the brain will continue to return to that behavior when it wants to recreate that feeling again. And this is where the sort of pattern of gambling addiction begins to form. This is where things start to become confusing, especially for people who don't understand addiction. If losing money creates pain and stress, shouldn't that break the pattern? Logically, it seems like it should, but the brain isn't always operating on logic when it comes to emotional learning or reasoning. And what the brain remembers most strongly is the state change that the gambling provided or created. And so the brain learns that placing a bet creates excitement, anticipation, stimulation. And so when someone experiences the stress of losing money, the brain often tries to return to the same behavior that previously created the state change. In other words, losing money can actually increase emotional discomfort. And when emotional discomfort increases, the brain searches for ways to relieve it. But if gambling has become the brain's learned way of creating relief or stimulation, then the urge to gamble can actually become stronger after a loss. This creates the loop where the person feels discomfort, stress, boredom, fear, anxiety, sadness, guilt, shame, grief, whatever it is. They place a bet to change their state, and then they experience an outcome. Imagine if it's a loss. That just adds right in to more stress, more frustration, more agitation, more irritation, more anxiety, right? And then they place a bet to relieve the stress to hopefully get a new outcome. But what happens if they lose again? Then it comes back. And this just keeps happening over and over and over again. And so this is quite literally where another psychological layer enters, that after a loss, the brain often generates thoughts like, I can win it back, or just one more bet. These thoughts can feel extremely convincing in the moment, but what many people don't realize is that these thoughts are often being driven by the brain's desire to recreate the emotional state associated with gambling. The brain isn't chasing money, it's chasing the feeling that gambling creates. It's never about the money. If you know this channel, if you've watched this channel before, I've mentioned this many times, never about the money. It's always about the feeling that a person might believe they're going to feel if they receive the money. So dopamine plays a major role in this pattern. Dopamine is often misunderstood as a pleasure chemical, but in reality, it's more closely connected to anticipation and motivation. It drives the brain to pursue experiences that might produce a reward. Gambling is one of the most powerful dopamine triggers because the reward is unpredictable. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, and that uncertainty keeps the brain highly engaged. Each time a bet is placed, dopamine rises in anticipation of what might happen next. And because the reward is unpredictable, the brain continues to chase the possibility of the next win. Even after losses, the brain holds on to the memory of a previous win or near wins. And these memories reinforce the belief that the next bet could change everything. And this belief fuels the motivation to continue gambling, even when the logical part of the mind knows the losses are adding up. So when you step back and you look at this pattern, gambling addiction becomes to look a little bit less like a discipline problem and more like a nervous system loop. The brain has learned that gambling creates a specific emotional and physiological state. Once that learning occurs, the nervous system begins to seek that state again whenever the person feels stressed or bored or anxious or overwhelmed. And because the pattern operates at a deeper level than conscious logic, simply telling yourself to stop is often not enough. And many gamblers really genuinely do try to stop. They delete the apps, they avoid the casinos, they promise themselves that they're done, they have their spouse hold their money, whatever. And for a period of time, they may even succeed in this. But eventually, a stressful day, a moment of boredom, a strong emotional trigger reactivates the pattern. And then what happens? The urge to gamble can feel incredibly powerful, not because the person is weak, but because the nervous system has learned that gambling creates this powerful shift in emotional state. It does not want to be anxious and afraid and bored and lonely and all these things. It doesn't want to be here. It doesn't want to be in pain. Your nervous system wants to be in a parasympathetic state, in a pleasurable state. And so relapse often happens in a very specific moment. A person feels uncomfortable emotionally, remembers the relief or excitement gambling once created, and then the thoughts appear maybe just one more bet, maybe just one more time will change everything. And in that moment, the brain is not thinking about long term consequences. It is thinking about immediate state change, instant gratification. And that is why people can gamble again, even after significant losses. Once you understand that gambling addiction operates through emotional and nervous system patterns, the behavior starts to make much more sense. It stops looking like irrational self destruction and starts looking like the brain repeating a learned strategy for changing how it feels. The problem is that this strategy eventually creates more harm than relief, and it sort of builds up over time without you realizing it. The encouraging part of this, hopefully, is that patterns learned by the brain can also be changed. When someone begins to understand the emotional triggers, the nervous system responses, the subconscious associations connected to gambling, it becomes very possible to interrupt the loop. The urge to gamble doesn't disappear through force or shame. It begins to weaken when the underlying pattern is actually addressed. If you are someone who has struggled with gambling and felt confused about why losing money didn't stop you, it's important to understand that you're not broken, you're not weak. What you're experiencing is a powerful learned pattern inside the brain, inside the nervous system. And once that pattern is understood, it becomes much easier to start changing it. Gambling addiction is not just about money. Actually, it's not about money at all, to be honest with you. It's about the emotional state that the brain learned to chase. Right? It's that's the thing that we're chasing. And when that state is addressed in healthier ways, the grip of gambling can begin to loosen. So for people who feel stuck in the cycle and want help breaking the pattern, I do work with clients privately where we focus on resetting the nervous system responses and changing the underlying associations connected to gambling. But whether you work with someone or simply begin learning about the psychology behind this pattern, understanding what's actually happening is the first step toward freedom. That's it for now, guys. Hope you guys have a great week, and goodbye for now.